Assalamu alaikum. The National Assembly on 17 January unanimously passed the Criminal Laws Amendment Bill. The bill seeks to amend Section 298A of Pakistan Penal Code. Section 298A of PPC in its current form states, and I quote, "Whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by visible representation or any imputation, innuendo, or insinuation directly or indirectly defiles the sacred name of any of the wives, Ummul or members of the Holy Prophet's family, Ahl Bayt alayhim salam, or any of the righteous caliphs, Khulafai Rashidin, or companions of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to 3 years, or with fine, or with both." The bill, currently moved by Jamaat Islami's member of National Assembly, Abdul Akbar Chitrali, proposes to enhance punishment under this section from up to 3 years imprisonment with a minimum of 1 year and fine to imprisonment for up to life and minimum of 10 years. Since the bill proposes to make the offence alleged under this section non-bailable, it therefore renders it procedurally tougher for the accused to get relief. The bill, after being unanimously approved by the National Assembly, has now been transmitted to the Senate for its approval. This development has raised concern among the religious as well as sectarian minorities who have been bearing the brunt of the oppressive and frequently misused laws on offences related to religion, which we commonly call the blasphemy laws. They fear that the amendment, once it happens, will lead to their increased persecution. Most of the accusations against alleged blasphemers are not true, and this is supported by the judgments of the various courts. They rather originate from personal and political feuds. That's why, where we see non-Muslims being targeted under these laws, a large number of Muslims, especially from sectarian minorities, are also suffering. No one here approves of being disrespectful towards Holy Prophet, his wives, family members, and pious caliphs. But it is also a fact that differences have existed between Muslims, especially over historical events and personalities associated with them. And more specifically, in our domestic context, Pakistan is home to diverse religious minorities, and even the Muslim majority has numerous sects. Therefore, this issue needs to be handled with utmost sensitivity instead of passing controversial laws that can aggravate the problem. The attitude of the politicians towards this issue is rather unfortunate. They regrettably turn a blind eye to efforts to further weaponize blasphemy laws instead of acting to address the reality of these laws being continuously misused to intimidate, persecute, and violate the rights of the accused. Joining me in today's panel discussion on this very important topic are Mr. Asad Jamal. Mr. Jamal is a renowned Lahore-based lawyer who has worked extensively on religious freedoms. We have with us Mr. Haris Khaliq. Mr. Khaliq is a poet and civil society activist. He is currently Secretary General of Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. Our third panelist is Mr. Ali Abbas Zaidi. Mr. Zaidi is an aeronautical engineer by profession, but he has worked extensively on ways and means to counter extremist violence in Pakistan. So we'll start with the question which will be asked from Mr. Asad Jamal. Asad Saab, can you give us a brief overview of this bill and explain how significant is this legislation given our context in which blasphemy laws have allowed legal discrimination and persecution in the name of religion for decades? Since you would be giving strictly a legal opinion, would you let us know if this legislation conforms with the liberties guaranteed in our constitution?
Thank you very much, Sajjad Saab. So this bill, which has been passed by the National Assembly only a couple of weeks back, uh, uh, does two or three very important and negative things to the pre-existing provision in the Chapter 15 of Pakistan Penal Code, which is about blasphemy laws. It changes Section 298A in a significant way. One is that it enhances the punishment to life imprisonment. The existing framework provides a punishment which is up to imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to 3 years. So this is a very radical, a very drastic change which is being proposed and has been approved by the National Assembly. Uh, Now, I'll come to the possible consequences of this enhancement in punishment a little later. But at the same time, it also uh, makes the person who may be liable under this provision uh, liable to non-provision of bail. So the change which has just been introduced makes this offense under Section 298A a non-bailable offense and something which will be uh, taken cognizance of by the police without warrants. So this is very serious and very drastic kind of changes which are being proposed. Now, this bill has been transmitted to the Senate of Pakistan, which will have the opportunity to reconsider the bill, and hopefully it will be rejected by the Senate. Uh, Now, there are two or three very important things which we need to understand. That this is now a well-established fact that the provisions in our legal framework, which includes not just the Pakistan Penal Code, but also the Anti-Terrorism Act, as well as the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, and so many other provisions, other statutes, which contain provisions relating to uh, which contain provisions which criminalize speech. Now, our Article 19 gives the fundamental right to free speech, but it is subject to a couple of uh, unreasonable restrictions, I would say. Though those restrictions which are expressed in the Article 19 of the Constitution of Pakistan are that such freedom of speech is uh, restricted by the object of glory of Islam, defense and integrity of Pakistan, etc. That is a subject which we can discuss in a separate sitting. But very briefly, let me say that any restrictions which may be imposed under a democratic setup have to conform with the modern idea of freedoms, of democracy, the principles of democracy. Uh, they should not be, and they cannot be framed in such a way which give the state arbitrary power, or such power which may be used or which may be abused in a very arbitrary manner. So that is the fundamental principle when we interpret Constitution's Article 19, which guarantees the freedom of speech as well as freedom of press, etc. Now, this chapter 15 of Pakistan Penal Code, as well as the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, Anti-Terrorism Act, and certain other statutes, violate these basic principles. Thus, they violate Article 19. That is our argument. And that has always been the argument of civil society, human rights workers in Pakistan. Now, Article 9 of the Constitution gives the fundamental right to liberty, personal liberty, as well as right to life. When you criminalize speech and you criminalize any other offense, any other act or omission, and as a result, you provide a harsh punishment, there's always this risk, serious risk, and real risk that these two fundamental rights, which are guaranteed in Article 9 of the Constitution of Pakistan, may be violated. Because the harsher the punishment gets, the higher the imprisonment, possible imprisonment provided in the law, the greater possibility is that there will the persons who may be targeted or attacked in an arbitrary manner may not be able to get bail. And this is provided in the Code of Criminal Procedure. And this is one of the fundamental problems with this proposed draft amendment. And the other problem is that, I mean, this is what has happened with this law 298A, that the punishment which is now being proposed is being enhanced from maximum of 3 years of imprisonment to life imprisonment. This is a very, very, very drastic measure which is going to be taken. Now, life imprisonment in Pakistan means that a person may be imprisoned up to 17, 18, 19, or 20 years. And if that doesn't happen, I mean, once convicted, that could be the case. If that doesn't happen, the trial can go on for a long period of time, 3 years, 4 years, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. You never know. In blasphemy cases, now this is becoming a normal thing to observe, that the trials linger on, and the person who is who has been accused of blasphemy under any one of the provisions of this chapter or any other law is likely to spend an average of 4 to 5 years behind bars. So these are the consequences which we need to take into considerations. And the other thing is that when you deny bail to anyone accused of any offense, the right to liberty is violated. The problem is that our laws relating to bail infringe fundamental rights guaranteed in the Constitution, as well as the international legal framework. For instance, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights requires Pakistan to frame laws which guarantee effective guarantee to personal liberty, which is not the case with the framework which we have. So when we talk about Chapter 15 of Pakistan Penal Code or any law relating to speech, we see that they are abused on a very routine basis. The latest example which we can cite in this context is Fawad Chaudhry's criminal case in which he has been arrested and remanded for interrogation by the police. So I think one can go on and on about this framework, and I think we will have ample opportunities to talk about various dimensions.
Yes, Asad Saab, you have given a very comprehensive overview, but just one aspect, if you could, in 1 or 2 lines, if you can explain this. Is there any religious justification for this legislation? Because as a layman, I understand that Islam is not such a hardline religion which would allow for such punishments for such offenses.
I think this question goes to the heart of the controversy. I don't know if you have heard about that very famous or infamous case of Ismail Qureshi versus the Federation of Pakistan, which was decided by the Federal Sharia Court in 1990 or 91. It has been reported in the law journals as well. In that case, as it has been reported by the court in its final verdict, now, let me also tell you that this is the case in which the Federal Sharia Court reached the conclusion that the punishment for you know, insulting the name of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, can only be mandatory death penalty. Now that verdict is a telling verdict. Everyone should read that. The verdict notes somewhere in you know, in the middle, that there is a controversy about whether what kind of punishment should be given to a person who blasphemes the name of the Holy Prophet. And it is very obvious that the discussion which was held in the courtroom, the arguments which were raised by different ulama, there was absolutely no consensus, no agreement even between them. And very you know, formidable arguments and facts from Islamic history were presented that mandatory death punishment was not the case, was not an option for the court to uphold. Now, the petitioner Ismail Qureshi went to the Federal Sharia Court with the contention that under 295C of Pakistan Penal Code, death could only be the punishment. And this was debated at, you know, great length. And though I think that the justices who agreed upon this decision, they did not, unfortunately, write down all the arguments in as detail as they must have been raised in the courtroom. Even then, it is very clear that there was no agreement between ulama. So I think this question has also been, you know, discussed various other scholars recently as a few years back. A young scholar, Arafat Mazhar, he has talked about it, though I don't agree with all which he has to say and all his conclusions, but that his study also shows that there is no agreement on what kind of punishment is to be given to any blasphemer of any kind. So there are different kinds of blasphemy provisions in different statute books, which we need to review. And I think I can quote other scholars as well internationally who have written internationally, and there are books on blasphemy now. So we can go into that kind of detail as well. So I don't think there is any rational, any basis in Islamic law which would be available for enacting this kind of framework. And these laws, these provisions are very, very widely worded, vaguely worded, uncertain, and they can be twisted by anyone, anytime, in any way. So, I mean, even if one were to even, you know, discuss Islamic history in a critical way, that could also be construed as blasphemy. So this has a very deep impact on the psyche of the people of Pakistan. Academic freedoms have been curtailed. People do not want to anymore talk about, discuss Islamic history because they are scared that it may not hurt the sentiments of some individuals. So it is, I think, a very, very unfortunate development since 1980s, particularly 1980s, when General Zia, first of all, started changing this framework. And the first and foremost provisions which he introduced were actually intended to target one of the Islamic sects. So I think the very foundation of these changes which we have introduced after independence in 1947 were actually malicious, dishonest.
Okay, Haris Khaliq Sahab, coming to your organization, Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, in its statement, while expressing the concern on this legislation, had stated that it fears that it was likely, this legislation is likely to exacerbate the persecution of Pakistan's beleaguered religious minorities and minority sects. it must have been the government's responsibility to safeguard its religious and sectarian minorities. How do you see the government's role on this? We saw that this legislation was passed with consensus. Nobody opposed it in the assembly. Even the minority members didn't oppose it.
Thank you, Bakir Sajjad Sahab. I'm very thankful that you have invited me to speak on the subject. But I'm afraid I have another meeting starting very soon, so I'll just make one intervention. But it will be a bit of I will try to be as comprehensive as possible. Maybe I sound disjointed in the middle, but I'll try to be as comprehensive as possible in responding to your answer.
So if you give brief answers, I can ask you 2 questions. Aris, if you are brief, I can ask you just 2 questions. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So Asad has actually, given you the whole legal structure and the malicious intent, what Asad calls malicious intent. I think we have to go back in history a little bit, not ancient history, but kind of recent history, and look at the post-colonial Islamic countries or Muslim majority countries. And 2 things I would like to point out. One is that all our laws, which we have made more stringent over the years, which are anti-people, where citizens are considered subjects and treated likewise, are colonial laws. So the 1927, 1923, the Official Secrets Act, sedition laws, treason, law of treason, blasphemy laws, they were all introduced in early 20th century by the British. So this is something that we need to consider, that the continuity of these laws and making them more stringent in many cases actually confirms the fact that Pakistan remains a colonial state. And Pakistan's permanent institutions of the state, unfortunately, are inherited from the British colonial administration. But unfortunately, the parliament also behaves in a certain way where the elite capture and the capture of certain majoritarian groups it gets reflected in any resolution that they pass or any such law they bring about and call it a consensus law. So one is, we have to get rid of all the colonial laws, whether it is sedition, treason, blasphemy, or Official Secrets Act. I think that is fundamental in trying to, if we wish to become a modern republic. One is that. The other thing is that if you call yourself an Islamic republic or an Islamic state or an Islamic kingdom, as in case of Saudi Arabia, an Islamic republic as in case of Iran, an Islamic emirate as in case of Afghanistan, an Islamic republic again as in case of Pakistan, then if you have a faith which defines the ideological bases for your country, then you will eventually end up with having the majoritarian sect rule. And you can see that in Saudi Arabia, you can see that in Iran, you can see that in Afghanistan, and now, unfortunately, Pakistan is progressing in the same direction. So it is becoming, a majoritarian sectarian state, and this law confirms that. And it is unfortunate that people who belong to other faiths and other sects find themselves either intimidated or out of political expediency, these laws are passed by consensus. So I think so we have to deal with the issue at two levels politically. I'm not getting into the legal frameworks because that's not my forte. And Asad has been very, spot on and comprehensive. But this is a problem that if you have a faith defining the bases for the state, you will have a sect defining that faith. And that is something we need to think about. Pakistan's constitution has rights, but those rights are qualified. Article 19 is a qualified right. You can't say anything. I mean, how do you define the abstract concept of glory of Islam? Because, for instance, if most of us are Muslims, whether different, belonging to different sects or denominations, historically we will be practicing our faith, and we will be respectful of our, our Aimma or our Anbiya or our, the Akabirin, the elders, as it were. And so why do we need to legislate against the majority of people? Or why do we need to legislate against 2 or 3% of the minorities? So in Article 19, you can't say anything about the military, you can't say anything about the judiciary, you can't say about the glory of Islam. So that is again a qualified right. So freedom of expression is not guaranteed in Pakistan's constitution per se. One. Two, if you look at the the structure of how our decision making is done. For instance, the Council of Islamic Ideology, which is a statutory body and an irrelevant institution, because we have a federal Shariat court and we have an article, I believe Asad will correct me if I'm wrong, there's an article in the Constitution 137 or 37, I don't exactly remember that, which actually says that any legislation which is repugnant to the principles of Islam cannot be passed by any of the legislatures in the country, whether they are provincial legislatures or the federal legislature. So if you have an article in the Constitution confirming or making it clear that nothing repugnant to the basic tenets of Islam can be legislated, why do you need a Council of Islamic Ideology? Likewise, when you have a federal Shariat court, to which Asad also referred to in his talk, why do you need a Council of Islamic? And look at the composition of the Council of Islamic Ideology. Have you ever seen the Council of Islamic Ideology being led by a cleric who is either not influenced by Jamaat Islami or who is not from the Deobandi denomination within the Sunni sect? Can you name them? You can't. So this is something that is very interesting, that the 12 or 14 or 10 members of the Council of Islamic Ideology, the majority and the chairpersonship always goes to a particular denomination within the majority sect. So these are issues that we need to deal with. If you want to create a theocracy in Pakistan, it will definitely be a sectarian theocracy. So the best way to go forward is to accept and recognize that Islam is the majority faith, and nothing will be, as is defined in the Constitution, nothing will be legislated which is repugnant to the basic principles. What are the basic principles? Be honest, be good to your neighbor. There are so many values that you can draw upon. But if you try to make it a theocracy, then you will end up becoming a sectarian theocracy. And unfortunately, that is what we see by the passing of this bill.
Oh, thank you, Haris. I think the other question that I had, you have also addressed this in your intervention. Now, let's go to Ali Abbas. Ali Abbas, we are seeing, I think Asad also referred to this, that the intent of the blasphemy laws was to target a particular sect. But now we are practically seeing the sectarianization of blasphemy laws. They're being weaponized in a way that they target one particular sect. There was a time when Muslims from the Shia minority sect were victims of sectarian violence. More recently, we see a surge in blasphemy cases against Shia Muslims. Can you explain this shift in the tactics of the extremist groups? On the face, it looks to be a continuation of the strategy to prevent Shia Muslims from holding their religious rituals. Abbas, I'm saying this because most of those sectarian attacks were targeted at their worship places, and now most of these blasphemy cases originate from the speeches made at majalis or other religious gatherings. Do you see any linkage between the two?
Thank you very much. IPI and Bakir Sajjad Saab and Asad Jamal Saab and Haris Kalik, you guys are doing an amazing job in providing a platform where such important issues can be discussed. Because the last time I checked, this debate should have happened at the National Assembly, which passed this bill. I wonder what the Standing Committee on Human Rights and Interior at the National Assembly is doing, because it's such a controversial and heartbreaking moment for a huge part of our population. It impacts their lived experience, their citizenship, it impacts their trust on the state, it impacts their identity, and their representatives were not even called to have their version at the prime forum in the parliament, at the lower house in the National Assembly, which passed this bill. So organizing such an event, discussing the confines and constraints of such a law which impacts our lives in such a huge manner, is very much needed. I hope what Asad Jamal Saab said comes true, that Senate will be intelligent enough not to pass this bill, but I'm not very sure. अच्छा जी, अब मैं इसको,
I
you know,
must
I
just
see.
add one thing over here, that I wanted to invite some of the leaders, leaders of the political parties who are present in the Senate, but none of them were ready to come and speak here on this issue, and this is very sensitive. You may invite us on some other occasion.
जी जी,
So you can
मैं तो
understand
खुल के बात करूंगा,
that exists among our political elite.
जी, अच्छा,
If you allow
very
me to
interesting
say just a,
Yes.
जी, please.
Abbas sahab, actually, there is a very real fear that the Senate might pass this bill. Just 4-5 years ago, in 2017, Section 298 was also amended in similar way. Punishment was enhanced from maximum of 3 years to 1 year, from 1 year to 3 years, and no less than 1 year. And a fine of 0.5 million was added to the pre-existing maximum punishment of imprisonment only up to 1 year. So the harsher the punishment, the greater the incentive for people to abuse this law.
बिल्कुल सही। और दूसरा, असद साहब, मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि क्योंकि इलेक्शन का टाइम है ना, 2023 would be a time for elections, and I fear that even the big mainstream parties who traditionally take a side when it comes to such controversial laws wouldn't be ready to, you know, divide their potential vote bank. I fear, because I have been talking to a lot of senators who have traditionally stood up against such measures, and they are not very confident in saying that their parties or the relevant committees within the Senate would be, you know, very clearly denouncing this bill. To come back to Bakir Saab, what you said, something very interesting happened with the emergence of COVID pandemic in Pakistan, 2020. Because in 2020, what happened was that in the previous two years, sectarian violence targeted at the Shia minority community came down a bit. I mean, as far as numbers are concerned, the violent attacks from 2017 and 19, as compared to the levels before 2017, drastically reduced. So there were military operations, the militant outfits like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi were combed out, whatever. But something else happened. Because of this kind of mainstreaming policy that maybe our establishment or stakeholders have, they were able to shift this violence from a street level bloodshed to turning it towards a kind of a using blasphemy against Shia Muslims in the country. For example, in the year 2020, just during Muharram, more than 40 blasphemy cases were registered against the Shia Muslims across the country. So if we extrapolate it to the yearly level, my assessment is that more than 50% cases of 50% of the blasphemy cases registered since 2020, 21, 22 are against Shia Muslims. This has never traditionally happened in Pakistan. The blasphemy law disproportionately affected the non-Muslim minorities, the Christians and the Hindus, and legally, constitutionally speaking, Ahmadi, poor Ahmadi Muslims and all of that, you know. But this shift towards Shia Muslims, and we see that क्योंकि आपने violent तंजीमें जो कि लश्कर-ए-जंगवी थी, उसको तो ban कर दी lawmakers, because you see, if I am being represented in the lower and the higher house by my representatives, then it's very sad to see that people who even have 35 years of legislative experience remaining mum on this, you know. It's an absolutely shame of a thing that is taking place now. It is so hard to even talk to them and to rationalize that what their future action on this particular law would be. So I'm hopeful, but I'm not very convinced that the mainstream parties, including the Pakistan People's Party, including the PTI, would be taking a very clear stance on this, despite assurances in private meetings that they have relayed to certain members of the minority communities who have been talking to them about this bill. So yeah, so that is my summary. I think it impacts it impacts my citizenship, my relation with the state. It impacts my belief, my trust in the constitution and the representative houses of this country. It impacts my lived experience as a contributing citizen in this country, you know. So it has that emotional and that humane angle to it, besides the legal and constitutional angle. Thank you, Ji.
Just, I'd like to put the same question to Asad Saab, which on the note that you concluded, the political aspect, when, the minorities are represented in the parliament, but they're not strong enough to challenge these laws, just like many of our moderate Muslim friends elected from mainstream parties, although they have suffered from these laws, they don't challenge it because of the dominant religious sentiment. So meanwhile, the sectarian minorities aren't all that well represented in the two houses of the parliament. Asad Saab, I had asked you about the prospects of challenging this legislation in the court, because once the minorities did not object to it while it was being discussed in the National Assembly, because of the dominant perception, the challenging that law could have had consequences for them. And secondly, even the moderate Muslims who are represented in the mainstream parties, they didn't try to challenge it because of the prevailing political environment, which Zedi also pointed to. So what are the prospects of taking this matter to the courts of law and then trying to get some sort of relief from there?
Answering your last bit of your question, no, we can't go to the court. No one can go to the court against any legislation which may be in the process of being passed by the National Assembly or the Senate or Parliament in joint session. And you're right, no debate actually took place. There is no, well-considered, well-reasoned report presented by the standing committee, the concerned standing committee. It's just one sentence. So you can imagine the kind of hush which prevailed over the members of the committee as well as the National Assembly in passing this law. So anyone talking, raising any question about blasphemy laws is seen to be someone who is questioning Islam, perhaps. I think that's the kind of idea which I get. But I do hope that someone will speak up in the Senate, even if behind closed doors. If not that, I hope assemblies will be dissolved and new elections will be called. Other than that, I don't see much of a hope.
So thank you, Asad Saab, Haris Khalik Saab, and Libas Zedi Saab for sparing time to join us. And we concluded on the note that, with the hope, that sanity prevails in the Senate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ji. Thank you. Good afternoon.